$17,752,500. That's not a house. That's not a Lamborghini. That's not even a private jet. That's what someone paid for a single Rolex watch in a bidding war that lasted for 12 minutes. That same watch originally cost $210 back in 1972. That same watch that spent decades on one man's wrist, accumulating scratches, picking up sweat, getting battered through race car crashes and Hollywood film sets. But it's not the only crazy expensive Rolex deal ever, and today we're breaking down 12 of the most legendary Rolex sales in history. We'll talk about the ones that broke records, shattered expectations, and proved that sometimes a watch isn't just a watch. It's a piece of cultural DNA worth more than most people's life savings. Number 12. The mythical beast, the unicorn, Daytona reference, 6265. In May 2018 in Geneva, Switzerland, Phillips Auction House presents Daytona Ultimatum, a thematic auction featuring 32 of the rarest Rolex Daytonas ever made. The star of the show? A watch that collectors had nicknamed the Unicorn. Why? Because it was the only known example of a vintage, manual winding Rolex Cosmograph Daytona ever made in 18-karat white gold. Rolex built thousands of Daytonas in stainless steel. They made plenty of yellow gold. But white gold? For a sports chronograph in the 1970s, that was unheard of. Here's why this is so shocking. The Daytona was designed as a tool watch for race car drivers, something you'd wear, sweat in, bang around. Most were stainless steel for exactly that reason: durable, practical, and affordable. But around 1970, Rolex made white gold day dates, their most glamorous dress watch. Using precious metal for a luxury timepiece made sense. Using it for a sports chronograph, that was borderline insane. Yet for one lucky customer, reportedly a German retailer who placed a special order, Rolex did exactly that. They created reference 6265 in 18-karat white gold, fitted it with a black Sigma dial, and delivered it in 1971. For decades, this watch lived in complete obscurity. Then, around 2010, legendary Italian watch collector John Goldberger discovered it. He recognized immediately what he had: a one-of-one Rolex Daytona that defied everything collectors thought they knew about the brand's production history. Goldberger kept it private for years. Then, in 2013, he appeared on a Hodinkee Talking Watches episode and showed the watch to the world. The watch community lost its mind, but Goldberger always said it would never be sold. It was irreplaceable, a museum piece. But in 2018, he changed his mind. He decided to auction it, with all proceeds going to Children Action, a Geneva-based foundation helping youth worldwide. The estimate? $3 million minimum. The result? $5,937,500, nearly double the estimate. And at the time, it made the Unicorn the second most expensive Rolex ever sold at auction, right behind Paul Newman's Daytona. And that Paul Newman's deal? Crazy, but we'll get to it later on. So, back to Goldberger's deal. The auction was electric. Collectors from 43 countries participated. Kevin O'Leary from Shark Tank reportedly bid. In the room, serious collectors were standing, gesturing, shouting bids. Why such intensity? Because opportunities like this don't come around. Ever. This wasn't just rare. This was singular. One watch, one chance. And whoever bought it would own the only vintage white gold Daytona that Rolex ever made. The winner? Again, anonymous. But here's what makes this story even crazier. After the sale, some collectors raised questions. They noticed that certain parts of the watch appeared to have been restored or replaced over the years. Goldberger himself later confirmed that when he acquired the watch, it was in rough condition and had been carefully serviced to bring it back to what he believed was its original state. This sparked a debate that still rages today. When does restoration cross the line into modification? Is the Unicorn truly original, or is it a curated vision of what Goldberger thought it should be? Regardless of where you fall on that debate, one thing is undeniable. The Unicorn proved that rarity and story can overcome almost any concern. A one-of-one Rolex from a legendary collector sold for charity? That's a narrative too powerful to ignore. But if the unicorn showed what happens when Rolex makes something nobody expects, the next sale proved that sometimes royalty gets the watches that even billionaires can't buy. We're talking about an emperor, a peace negotiation, and a Rolex so unique that its dial layout has never been replicated. Number 11. The Emperor's Timepiece, the Bao Dai, reference 6062. On May 14, 2017, in Geneva, Switzerland, an unforgettable deal happened. Philips, in association with Bax and Russo, presents the Geneva Watch Auction 5. Lot 88 comes up, and the room goes silent, because everyone knows what they're witnessing. The Rolex triple calendar, reference 6062, known as Bao Dai, named after its original owner, the last emperor of Vietnam. After 8 minutes of bidding warfare, 10 in-room bidders, multiple phone bidders, the price rockets past the $1.5 million estimate within seconds. Then, when the hammer dropped, the final price was $5,060,427. At the time, it became the most expensive Rolex ever sold at auction. 6 months later, Paul Newman's Daytona would break that record, again with Paul Newman. That Newman deal was crazy, but before then, and for a brief moment, the Bao Dai was king. What made that watch so special? Here's the story. In Geneva, Switzerland, the world powers meet at the Hôtel des Bergues to negotiate the future of Vietnam following the Indochina War. Among the delegates were Prince Nguyen Phuc Vinh Thuy, known as Bao Jai, the last emperor of Vietnam. During a recess, Bao Jai steps out to stretch his legs. He doesn't know it yet, but within hours, his country will be divided. His empire, which had ruled for over a century, will effectively end. He crosses the street and enters Chronométrie Philippe Béguin, a renowned Rolex retailer. His request is simple. He wants a Rolex, something special. The dealer shows him the reference 6062, a triple calendar with moon phase crafted in 18-karat yellow gold. It's one of the most complicated Rolexes of the era, featuring day, date, month, and moon phase all on the dial. But here's where it gets unique. Only 3 reference 6062 watches were ever made with black dials. Bao Jai's is the only one with diamond hour markers at the even hours of 2, 4, 6, 8, and 10 o'clock, while the odd hours feature gold arrowhead markers. And to accommodate the diamond at 12 o'clock, Rolex had to move the iconic Rolex crown logo down on the dial. They also relocated the officially certified chronometer wording to below the moon phase indicator instead of above the subdials. This dial layout exists on exactly one Rolex in the entire world, Bao Jai's watch. He wore it for decades, but in 2002, it first appeared at an auction, consigned by his family. It sold for $235,000, setting a record at the time for the most expensive Rolex ever sold. 15 years later, it returned to Philips. And this time, the result was 21 times higher. Why did it skyrocket? Provenance? Rarity? Historical significance? This isn't just a complicated Rolex. It's a watch owned by the last emperor of a dynasty that ruled for over a century. A watch purchased during one of the most pivotal moments in modern Vietnamese history. A watch with a dial configuration that will never be replicated because Rolex will never make another one like it. Oral Bax, the legendary auctioneer, called it a landmark of 20th century industrial design and said it belonged in a museum alongside the greatest cultural artifacts of the modern era. The buyer remains anonymous, but whoever they are, they own a piece of history that transcends horology. Then it gets more interesting. In October 2025, another reference 6062 with a black dial and diamonds surfaced at Monaco Legend Auctions. It sold for approximately $6,200,000, slightly more than the Bao Dai. Some collectors debate whether this one should rank higher, but most agree the Bao Dai's imperial provenance gives it the edge in cultural significance. Emperors and Hollywood legends dominated the early auction records. But what happens when a watch doesn't just belong to a celebrity, it becomes part of their legend? The next sale proved that sometimes a GMT master and a war film can create a mythology worth millions. Number 10. The Apocalypse Now watch. Marlon Brando's GMT master. In December 2019 at the Phillips auction house, a Rolex GMT Master Reference 1675 hit the block. This is not just any GMT, this is Marlon Brando's GMT, the watch he wore in Apocalypse Now while playing the unhinged Colonel Kurtz. The opening price was $1,950,000. Crazy, but things can be crazier because unlike Paul Newman's Daytona or the Baudai, Brando's GMT didn't sell through a traditional public auction with a hammer and a crowd. Instead, it was sold via Christie's in a private negotiated sale, and then, in 2023, it resurfaced again, this time reportedly trading hands for around $5,100,000. That's a 162% increase in just 4 years. What makes Brando's GMT so valuable isn't just that he wore it, it's how he wore it. In Apocalypse Now, Brando's character is a rogue army colonel who's gone completely off the grid in the Cambodian jungle. He's built his own kingdom, he's worshipped as a god, he's insane. And his watch? The bezel is completely removed. Nobody knows for sure why. Some say Brando did it himself to make the watch look more worn and battle-scarred. Others say director Francis Ford Coppola requested it to match the character's descent into madness. Either way, it became iconic. This is a reference 1675 GMT Master from the late 1960s or early 70s, a classic two-tone bezel GMT that's already highly collectible. But with Brando's name attached, with that bezel-less look forever tied to one of the greatest films ever made, it became something entirely different. The watch stayed in Brando's possession after filming. Eventually, it was passed down and later consigned for sale. When it first appeared in 2019, collectors went wild. This was Brando. This was Apocalypse Now. This was cinema history fused with horology. The estimated value, around $500,000. The actual price? Nearly 4 times that. And then, 4 years later, it resold privately for another significant increase. What's fascinating is that Christie's handled both sales through private negotiations rather than public auctions. That means we don't have the dramatic bidding war footage or the hammer fall moment, but the numbers speak for themselves. This watch proved something crucial. Celebrity provenance matters more than condition or originality. A GMT with no bezel, worn hard, beat up? Normally, that's a negative. But when it's Marlon Brando's GMT from Apocalypse Now, it's priceless. From Hollywood to European royalty to Geneva auction rooms, these mega sales all share one thing: provenance that can't be replicated. But what happens when rarity isn't about who owned it, but about Rolex making something they'd never made before and likely never will again? Number 9. The Stelline Stunner. Reference 6062 Stelline at Monaco Legend. When Monaco Legend Group hosted its exclusive timepieces auction in October 2025, it had a special watch among the lot, another Rolex reference 6062 triple calendar with moon phase. But this one is different from the Baudai. This one features a stelline, or tiny star-shaped hour markers, instead of diamonds or numerals. The bidding is intense. An Italian collector in the front row battles a phone bidder represented by renowned watch dealer Davide Parmigiani. Back and forth, 100,000 euro jumps, and when the dust settles, approximately $6,200,000, which when you break it down is 5.33 million euros plus buyer's premium. That makes it on paper more expensive than the Baudai. And technically, it bumped the Unicorn Daytona out of the third place spot on the all-time Rolex auction record list. But here's where it gets complicated. Monaco Legend Group auctions are sometimes less standardized than Phillips or Christie's sales. Some collectors debate whether this price should be ranked above the Baudai, arguing that the stelline dial's originality has been questioned over the years. The controversy centers on whether all the components, dial, hands, case, are completely original to this specific watch, or whether some restoration or part swapping occurred at some point in its history. Rolex never officially comments on these debates, so collectors are left to examine photos, compare details, and argue endlessly on forums. Regardless, the market has spoken. Someone was willing to pay $6,200,000 for this reference 6062. That means it's one of the 3 or 4 most expensive Rolexes ever sold publicly. What's clear is that the reference 6062, whether it's the Bao Dai, the Stelline, or any other variant, commands jaw-dropping prices for one simple reason: rarity. Only about 350 examples of the reference 6062 were ever produced between 1950 and 1953. It was one of only 2 vintage Rolex references to combine a waterproof oyster case, an automatic perpetual movement, and a full calendar with moon phase. Think about that. Rolex, the brand known for tool watches and simplicity, made a triple calendar moon phase, and then almost immediately stopped. They wouldn't release another moon phase complication until the modern Cellini in the 2000s. So every reference 6062 that surfaces is a glimpse into a brief moment when Rolex experimented with high complications. And the market rewards that rarity with prices that would make most people's eyes water. Triple calendars and moon phases are impressive, but what if Rolex made something even more complicated? What if they built a split-seconds chronograph, one of the most difficult complications in watchmaking, and made it absolutely massive? That's exactly what happened with the next piece. Number 8. The Giant, reference 4113 split-seconds chronograph. If you're not a watch nerd, here's what you need to know. A split-seconds chronograph is one of the hardest complications to build. It's a chronograph that can time 2 events simultaneously using 2 independent seconds hands. Now imagine Rolex, known for making practical, robust tool watches, attempting this complication in the 1940s. The result? Reference 4113. Only about 12 examples are known to exist, and they're a massive 44 millimeters in diameter. That makes them the largest Rolex wristwatches ever made by case size. For context, most vintage Rolexes from this era were 32 to 36 millimeters. The reference 4113 is nearly 50% bigger. It was designed to be worn over flight suits by pilots, and that's why it's oversized, so it would be visible and functional. These watches have sold at auction for between $3.5 million and $4.1 million, depending on condition and provenance. The most famous sale was at Philips in 2016, where a reference 4113 hammered for $2.4 million, setting a Rolex auction record that stood until the Bao Dai beat it a year later. What makes these watches so valuable? Rarity, obviously. Only 12 known examples in the world, but also technical achievement. Rolex rarely dabbled in high complications. They were the brand of submariners and explorers, watches you could beat up and depend on. The reference 4113 showed that when Rolex decided to push boundaries, they could build something that rivaled the greatest watchmakers, and then they stopped. Rolex never made another split-seconds chronograph. They moved on to perfecting their tool watches and left the haute complications to brands like Patek Philippe and Vacheron Constantin. This makes the reference 4113 a unicorn in its own right, a glimpse into an alternate timeline where Rolex focused on technical mastery over rugged practicality. We've covered emperors, actors, and technical marvels, but sometimes the biggest sales don't come from a single legendary watch. They come from a collection, and when that collection belongs to one of the most famous actors in history, the results can rewrite the market. That's what happened with Paul Newman's other Daytona. Number 7. The Big Red Daytona, Paul Newman's reference 6263. We'll still talk about the craziest deal involving Paul Newman's Daytona, but before then, we'll talk about June 2020 when Philips hosts Racing Pulse, a thematic auction focused on motorsports watches. Among the lots, another Paul Newman Daytona nicknamed Big Red because of the oversized red Daytona text on the dial. Paul Newman received this watch as a 25th wedding anniversary gift from Joanne Woodward. When he got it, he gave his original reference 6239, the one we'll still talk about, to James Cox. Newman wore the 6263 constantly throughout the 80s and 90s. Photos show him at racing events, pushers unscrewed, ready to time-lapse. Estimated sale price, around $3 million, but by the time the auction was done, it sold for $5,475,000. Now, here's the thing. Some sources claim this watch sold for $5.5 million. Others say it was part of a collection, and the individual price is harder to pin down. The exact number has been debated among collectors. What's clear is this: anything Paul Newman touched turned to gold. Celebrity ties clearly drive value. But what about watches that are just visually stunning? Watches where the dial itself is so rare and beautiful that collectors will pay anything to own it? That's where Lemon Dials and John Player Special Editions come in. Number 6. The Lemon Legend, Daytona Reference. 6263, The Legend. In Phillips Geneva, a Rolex Daytona Reference 6263 with an incredibly rare lemon dial, pale, creamy yellow, hits the auction block. That watch brightened up this auction that took place in November 2017. The watch is nicknamed The Legend due to its extraordinary condition and the rarity of this specific dial color. Lemon dials are almost mythical in the Daytona collecting world. They're not quite white. They're not yellow. They're this perfect, faded, champagne tone that only appeared on a tiny handful of 6,263 references in the 70s. Nobody knows exactly how many exist. Maybe a few dozen? Maybe fewer? What we do know is when one surface is in good condition, collectors lose their minds. This one was in exceptional shape. Original dial, original hands, original everything. No restoration, no funny business. No wonder it sold for $4,180,000, the buyer. Anonymous, as always. But whoever they are, they own one of the most beautiful Daytonas ever made, just like the buyer in this next incredible deal. Number 5. The Motorsport Icon, reference 6264, John Player Special. In December 2020, Sotheby's hosted an online auction, a relatively new format that was gaining traction during the COVID-19 pandemic. Among the lots were a Rolex Daytona Reference 6264, nicknamed John Player Special after the famous black and gold Formula One livery from the 70s. This watch features a black dial with gold subdials, creating a striking contrast that collectors immediately associated with the iconic JPS racing colors. The Reference 6264 is already rare. It was only produced for a brief period in the early 70s and features screw-down pushers for improved water resistance. It sold for $1,540,000. And at the time, it was celebrated as one of the most successful online watch auctions ever, because it proved that collectors were willing to spend serious money even without being in the room. Some sources initially called it the most expensive watch ever sold online, but that's not quite accurate. It was among the most notable at the time, but other online sales have since surpassed it. We've covered actors, emperors, rare dials, and online auctions. But what about watches owned by athletes, legends whose achievements transcend their sports? The results of the deals on this kind of watch will surprise you. Number 4. The Golden Bear's Watch, Jack Nicklaus, Day Date. When Phillips New York presented Game Changers, a thematic auction featuring watches owned by sports legends in December 2019, they didn't know how wholesome the event would turn out. The star lot was Jack Nicklaus's personal Rolex Day Date in 18-karat yellow gold. For those who don't follow golf, Jack Nicklaus is arguably the greatest golfer of all time. 18 major championships, 73 PGA Tour wins, 6 Masters victories, known as the Golden Bear. And this was his watch, the one he wore daily for years, the one on his wrist during tournaments, practice rounds, and everyday life. It's not a complicated watch. It's a Day Date, Rolex's flagship dress watch, featuring day and date complications, president bracelet, and a champagne dial. But it was Jack's, and he decided to sell it for charity, with proceeds benefiting Nicklaus Children's Healthcare Foundation. Jack got $1,220,000. Here's what makes this sale beautiful. The watch itself isn't rare. Rolex made thousands of gold Day Dates just like it. If you walked into a vintage dealer today, you could probably find a nearly identical one for $30,000. But this one was Jack Nicklaus, a man who dominated his sport for decades and became a global icon. Athletes, actors, emperors, they all drive massive prices. But what about watches tied to fictional characters? Watches that never actually appeared in the films they're supposedly from, but still command six-figure prices because of the myth they represent? That's where the James Bond Submariner debate comes in, and we'll be talking about it next. Number 3. The Spy's Submariner. Reference 6538, James Bond. This one is controversial. A Rolex Submariner reference 6538 surfaces at auction, allegedly worn by Sean Connery in early James Bond films. The watch sells for approximately $1,060,000. The problem is, nobody can definitively prove which exact Submariner appeared in which Bond films. Multiple 6,538 references were used across different movies, some scenes used different watches entirely, and Rolex never kept records of which specific serial numbers went to film productions. So when a 6538 surfaces claiming to be the James Bond Submariner, collectors get skeptical. But that said, the reference 6538 is legitimately tied to Bond. Connery definitely wore them on screen in Dr. No and other early films. They're big crown submariners from the late 50s and early 60s before Rolex added crown guards to protect the winding crown. The watch went for around $1 million, but would it be without the Bond connection? Probably not. But the myth is powerful enough that someone was willing to pay for it anyway. Here's the uncomfortable truth that most people don't want to talk about. Some of these record-breaking watches became flipping opportunities for collectors who never intended to keep them. That's where Eric Clapton's albino Daytona comes in. Number 2. The Musician's Mystery. Eric Clapton's albino Daytona. Eric Clapton is not just a legendary guitarist, he's also one of the most controversial figures in vintage watch collecting. Why? Because he's bought and sold some of the rarest Rolexes and Pateks in history, leading some collectors to accuse him of flipping rather than truly collecting. The most famous example, his albino Daytona reference 6263. An albino Daytona is incredibly rare. It's a black dial Daytona, where the subdials are also black instead of the usual contrasting white. Only a handful exist. Clapton bought his albino Daytona years ago for an undisclosed amount. Then, in the mid-10s, he consigned it to auction and sold it for around $1,400,000 to $1,600,000. The watch community's reaction was mixed. Some praised Clapton for his taste and timing, buying rare pieces early and selling at peak values. Others criticized him for treating watches like investments rather than objects of passion. The debate raises an interesting question. Is there anything wrong with flipping rare watches for profit? On one hand, auction houses love it. High-profile sales generate publicity and bring new collectors into the hobby. On the other hand, some purists feel that watches, especially historically significant ones, should be preserved and cherished, not traded like stocks. Clapton's albino Daytona sits right in the middle of that debate. It's an extraordinary watch that sold for an extraordinary price. Whether that's a celebration of smart collecting or an example of market manipulation depends on who you ask. What's undeniable is celebrity collectors like Clapton can single-handedly move markets. When someone with his name and resources buys rare watches and then sells them for millions, it legitimizes those valuations. It tells other collectors, yes, these prices are real. So those are the legendary sales, the watches that rewrote auction records, and right at the top is number 1, the ultimate crown, Paul Newman's actual Paul Newman Daytona. Nothing in the watch world has ever matched the cultural earthquake caused by Paul Newman's personal Rolex Cosmograph Daytona reference 6239. On October 26, 2017 in Phillips Auction House, New York City, the auction room was packed with over 700 people, journalists, collectors, billionaires, celebrities. Everyone knows this moment is historic before the hammer even moves. Auctioneer Oral Bax steps up and opens bidding, and immediately, a bidder screams out, $10 million, sir. The room erupts, gasps, shocked laughter. Some people stand up. Because here's the thing, most auctions inch upward gradually, 5,000, 10,000, 50,000. This one just leapt straight into the stratosphere. For 12 minutes, bidders fought, back and forth, phone bidders versus room bidders. By the time someone crossed the $15 million mark, there were only 2 left standing. The tension was suffocating. It was like watching a boxing match with the punch instead of fists. Then finally, the final price, $17,752,500. That made it, and it still is, the most expensive wristwatch ever sold at auction. Not just the most expensive Rolex, the most expensive watch, period. It beat the previous record held by a Patek Philippe by over $6 million. But why? Because this wasn't just any Paul Newman Daytona. This was the Paul Newman Daytona. The actual watch with the exotic dial worn by the actor himself for decades. His wife Joanne gifted him this watch, and Newman wore it constantly, racing, filming, everyday life, for decades. The watch became inseparable from his public image, so much so that in the 80s, when vintage watch collecting took off, dealers started calling any Daytona with this style of exotic dial a Paul Newman Daytona. In the mid-80s, Newman gifted the watch to James Cox, his daughter Nell's boyfriend at the time. Cox and Nell remained together for decades, and in 2017, they jointly decided to sell it. Proceeds would go to the Nell Newman Foundation and Newman's own foundation. They didn't expect that the watch would sell for that much, and the buyer, anonymous as usual, reportedly a phone bidder who may have been bidding on behalf of someone else. To this day, nobody knows who owns it, but here's what we do know. This sale fundamentally changed the watch market. It brought mainstream attention to vintage Rolex collecting. It created a new generation of collectors. It made people realize that watches aren't just accessories, they're cultural artifacts with stories that can command 8-figure prices. So that's the story. 12 legendary Rolex sales that broke the internet, and we've got more Rolex stories from where this came from. So, like the video and hit that subscribe button to stay informed. See you in the next video.